Okay, so new chapter, still in the chemistry unit, talking all about atoms this time. So, what exactly are they? What is the structure, and how did we learn what we know so far about atoms? And there's still a lot more that is unknown. So, first, some roots in atomic theory. Now, I will just say this going through this lecture, there's a lot of wording. I would definitely take the time to rewrite it in your own words, bullet point the key things. But yes, so some early ideas is people didn't really understand what atoms were, but they knew what matter was because they could feel it, they could see it. And so they thought that all matter was composed of just four primary elements: earth, wind, air, and fire. Most people believed that it was easily divided into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces indefinitely. But then some people came around and challenged that theory. So here are some early names that you're going to need to know. And I would definitely make some key points about what makes their ideas about matter different. So Democritus was actually way before his time. He was the first one that we have recorded anyway, to say that matter was composed of atoms. He called them atomos, but basically the idea was that all matter is composed of these tiny indivisible particles, and that they are similar in physical and chemical properties to whatever they make up to be. So if you had an atom of hydrogen, that one atom had the same properties as any mass amount of hydrogen. That was the smallest particle you could break up that had those properties. Aristotle came around and said, no, that can't be true because Democritus said that there was a bunch of empty space in those atoms. And he said, empty space can't exist. That makes no sense. So he brought us back to the idea that matter is earth, fire, wind, and air. And then it wasn't until much, much later that that idea was challenged, right? You just saw the timeline on the last one was like 300s. Now we're talking about 1766 when we first start hearing about that idea being challenged again. And they're going right back to what Democritus said, the whole idea of atoms in particles that make up things. So yes, again, the atoms are given the same properties of whatever element they make up. If you break them down beyond that, then they don't have the the properties of that substance, even though you can break them down, and that every atom has a similar ratio to form like these compounds, basically. And we'll talk more about this in the second lesson, but basically that just means that all hydrogen atoms are going to have the same mass or the same charge, right? All helium ones. Now, when things are reacting, that changes, but based on the way that our periodic table is organized, we have this mass or this amount of protons for hydrogen. Same with helium. When we make up a substance like water, it's going to be two hydrogens and an oxygen. So basically saying that these compositions are fixed. So now I'm talking more about what the atom is. The smallest particle of an element that retains those properties. I'm going to keep saying that because we need that definition. The way that they discovered them and they're able to see them is with a scanning tunneling microscope. We have lots of these high-powered microscopes in chemistry. This one is specific to looking at atoms. Really, I just want you to know what is the definition of an atom from this. So now that they knew what atoms were, it was, well, what are these atoms actually composed of? Like, what makes these? So the first experiment, and I have a video you're going to watch after this that kind of illustrates it better for you, was the cathode ray. And this is where we discovered what electrons were. So basically, they shot a ray from the cathode to the anode. So when you have a voltage source, the negative side is going to be the cathode, the positive side is going to be the anode. So when they shot that, they saw that there was kind of a light traveling through it, and it was kind of moving from the cathode towards the anode. And they were kind of figuring out what was that actually. And they determined that it had a negative charge and it was moving towards the positive charge. So that gives the idea that, okay, so matter has these negative charges and they called those electrons. So this experiment was made famous by J.J. Thomson. He manipulated it a couple different times, changing electric and magnetic fields to determine what is the actual ratio between the mass of these electrons, these particles, and their charge. He didn't necessarily figure out what it was, he just figured out the ratio. And he got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. So that's our first subatomic particle, the electron. Next experiment was done by Millikan, and this is called the Millikan oil drop experiment. Basically, what he did here was he was trying to figure out what is that actual charge of the electron. So he had positively and negatively charged plates, shot out some sorts of radiation, manipulated a couple different times to see if it would move towards like a positively charged plate or a negatively charged plate to determine its charge. So now that they knew electrons were negatively charged and that's the only subatomic particle they had, it didn't make sense that matter was neutral, right? Whatever you're touching right now, you're not feeling any electric shocks from it, probably. So what's causing that? Like what's balancing that negative charge? That was the next question that we needed to find out. But right now, the only model we had of the atom was J.J. Thomson's and what we call the plum pudding model, which was basically a sea of electrons within the spherical region. So this is J.J. Thomson's plum pudding model, and you see it's just randomly spread out electrons. And he assumed that the space in between is the matter that just had positive charges that was balancing off those electrons. And then there were some people who came and said, well, let's try that. Let's see if there's empty space in there or if there's just unknown matter we don't know that has positive charges that's making it neutral. So some other scientists came around. So next famous experiment was done by Ernest Rutherford. This was the gold foil experiment. So 3 experiments so far you need to know. The cathode ray with J.J. Thomson, the oil drop with Millikan, and now we have the gold foil experiment with Rutherford. So basically what he did is he shot out alpha particles, which have positive charges, at gold foil. And assuming that the gold foil has negative charges, like what we've determined so far with matter, he expected it to pretty much go through the foil, but maybe have a couple collisions if they actually collided with the electrons. But we'll see what he actually saw. While the vast majority of the particles did go straight through the gold foil, a good number of them actually bounced off at these pretty intense angles, which led to the question, well, what inside of the atom is actually causing it to reflect a positive charge? Because if it's all negative in there, it's going to attract those positive charges, allowing it to go through. So Rutherford concluded that atoms are made of mostly empty space, but that there is positive charge somewhere in the center. He called that dense area the nucleus. So he knew little about it, but at this point, aside from the fact that it was positively charged. So this was the next model of the atom that we had. This positive charge in the center, all these electrons floating around it in what we would call empty space. So Rutherford called those positively charged particles the protons. So now we have our protons and our electrons. James Chadwick later on got a Nobel Peace Prize for discovering the existence of neutrons. He did this because he realized that the mass of that center space, that nucleus, actually was more than what the amount of protons would be. And so there must have been something else in there that's not affecting the charges, and that was the neutrons. So far we have electrons with a negative charge, protons with a positive charge, and neutrons with a neutral charge. Remember that. So now this is what we're looking at with our atom. This here, sorry about that, the cloud got shifted, but basically you're going to have this cloud, this electron cloud around the nucleus. The nucleus is actually the smallest portion of the atom. While it's the most dense, that's where most of the mass is, it's actually pretty small compared to the size of the whole atom. And on the inside, you have your neutrons and you have your protons. In the next lesson, we'll talk about like how to figure out how many based on the type of atom. So then Niels Bohr came along and he suggested this model of the atom. He did this because of something we called quantum energy. You'll learn more about in chemistry, but basically the idea is that all atoms, all types of elements give off some sort of light spectrum. And you're going to do another virtual lab this week about the lights and the colors and the different properties of different elements. But basically, he noticed that with hydrogen specifically, that there were these specific different color bands of light, and he didn't know what was causing them. Then he realized that there are these different energy levels within an atom. And when the electrons move from these different energy levels, that's what emits the color, whether they're absorbing or releasing energy, right? So you're not going to have to know a whole lot about the energy levels and what their energy is. Just understand when an electron moves from one energy level to another, that is going to absorb or release energy. And that's where we get those different colors. So he said, well, if there's different energy levels, then there must be these like spherical orbitals. And he thought of them kind of like a planetary model. So sometimes the Bohr model will also be called the planetary model. Because if you look at this here, it kind of looks like the solar system, right? And you can see in the first image, this is the ground state. That means that's the normal state of the electron in whatever atom this is. But when it hopped to that next orbital, that's the excited state, and that's where you would see some emission. But this only accounted for certain elements. It didn't account for all of them, but he had a good idea. We expanded on this. So this is just an example of what those emission spectrums would look like. Again, you don't need to remember these numbers for this class. You can go ahead and do it. It'll help you in chemistry. This is just to show you how when you move from one level to another, that you are emitting certain amounts of energy and certain wavelengths of light. Okay. So the Bohr model, like I said, explained spectral lines, so basically the colors that were emitted from hydrogen atoms, but didn't explain all of them. Also, they discovered that the electrons didn't move in specifically circular orbits. They actually orbit in a couple different shape patterns you'll learn more about in chemistry again, but I'm going to show you a video here that kind of will help you see exactly what that looks like so you can kind of visualize it. But no, they don't move in these flat two-dimensional circular paths. Sometimes they're actually closer to the nucleus, sometimes they're further from the nucleus. So that's the main idea. And that's where we get the cloud model. So our current model is what we call the electron cloud model. And basically what this says is we don't know exactly where electrons are at any given time. We can know which orbital they're in, which just means what energy level. It doesn't mean like which ring, like in the Bohr model. So we know what energy level they could be in, but we don't know their exact location unless we kind of interfere with their movement. We can stop their movement for a second and figure out where they are, but as they're moving, we don't know exactly where it is. So we just say it's this cloud because it could be anywhere in that space. And in the center, we still have our nucleus with our protons and our neutrons. More recently, we've discovered another subatomic particle called a quark. Now, those make up our protons and our neutrons. How they discovered these is basically it was a particle accelerator. They accelerated protons at really high speeds towards each other. And then when the protons broke apart, they figured out that there was a subatomic particle within them. And they discovered 5 of them and assumed there was a 6th one. And they call those quarks. Right now, they don't know a whole lot about if they affect the chemical behavior of an atom, but we know that they're there. And this is our last slide. This is just a good visual for you to have, just to visualize the structure of an atom. This is our current model. I would draw this if I were you. So we have the electron cloud that has all our negatively charged electrons. We have the nucleus in the center that has our positively charged protons and our neutral neutrons. And then those two are made up of our quarks. And there you go. That is 12.1.